Why most empaths never reach the Sophia stage. And I need to begin by telling you what the Sophia stage is, because it is not a term you are going to find in a standard psychology textbook, not a clinically recognized developmental milestone, not something with a Wikipedia page or a peer-reviewed body of literature organized around it. The Sophia stage is something I am naming in this episode for a very specific reason, because the thing it describes is real, is psychologically identifiable, is consistently present in the small number of empaths who fully reach it, and has never been given a name that does justice to what it actually is. Sophia comes from the Greek word for wisdom, not knowledge, not intelligence, not the accumulation of information or the development of perceptive capacity, all of which the empath typically has in abundance long before she reaches this stage. Wisdom, the specific, rare, hard-won quality of someone who has not just understood her experience, but has been transformed by it in the deepest possible way. Transformed at the level of how she carries herself in the world, how she relates to her own suffering and other people's, how she inhabits the fullness of who she is without the anxiety that the fullness used to produce, without the apology that the depth used to require, without the performance of smallness that the first several decades of her life demanded in exchange for the belongings she could not afford to lose. The Sophia stage is what an empath becomes when she has done everything that the path of genuine emotional development requires of her, and come through it not diminished by the cost but expanded by it, made more completely herself by it. And the reason most empaths never reach it is not what you think. It is not a lack of effort. It is not insufficient sensitivity or insufficient intelligence or insufficient desire for the kind of wholeness the Sophia stage represents. The reason most empaths never reach it is something far more specific, far more addressable, and far more important to understand clearly if you are an empath who wants to know whether you are on the path toward it, or on one of the several very convincing detours that look like the path but lead somewhere else entirely. Let's start with what the path to the Sophia stage actually looks like, because it is not a straight line and it is not a comfortable one, and anyone who has described it to you as a journey of awakening that moves progressively toward greater peace and greater clarity and greater ease has either not been themselves or is describing a version of it that has been sanitized into something more marketable than honest. The path to the Sophia stage goes through things. Not around them, not over them, not with the assistance of a reframe that makes them less difficult than they actually are. Through them. Through the full experience of what it means to be someone who feels everything in a world that does not know what to do with people who feel this much. Through the relationships that required too much and gave back too little. Through the slow, grinding exhaustion of giving from empty for so long that the giving stopped feeling like generosity and started feeling like the last available proof of her own worth. Through the betrayals that arrived in the forms she was least prepared for, not from the people she had already identified as unsafe, but from the people she had decided were the exceptions, the ones who were different, the ones who had earned enough of her trust that the lowering of her defenses felt warranted, and the cost of that lowering, when it came, was correspondingly more devastating. Through the long, disorienting, identity stripping process of losing herself so completely in relationships and roles, and the performance of someone else's idea of who she should be, that she arrived at a moment of looking in the mirror and genuinely not recognizing the person looking back. Through all of that, and then through the equally long, equally nonlinear, considerably less dramatic but considerably more demanding process of finding her way back to herself. Not to the version of herself that existed before all of it, because that version is not available for return, but to something that contains everything that version was and everything the path made her, integrated into a self that is finally large enough to hold all of it, without any of it needing to be hidden or apologized for, or managed for other people's comfort. Most empaths make it through significant portions of this path. Most empaths who are drawn to conversations like this one have already navigated more of it than they typically give themselves credit for. They have done the therapy, or the deep self-examination that functions like therapy for the people who cannot access it. They have left the relationships that were costing them more than they were giving. They have developed to varying degrees the ability to recognize their own patterns. The overgiving, the self-erasure, the compulsive orientation toward other people's needs at the expense of their own, and to interrupt those patterns with an awareness and a frequency that represent genuine growth, compared to where they were when the patterns are invisible and entirely automatic. They have built, in some cases, a version of a life that is more theirs than anything they inhabited in the earlier chapters, with better boundaries, more selective relationships, a cleaner understanding of what they need, and a somewhat more reliable capacity to ask for it. All of this is real. All of this matters. All of this represents the kind of genuine development that the first several stages of the empath's psychological journey produce when they are navigated with honesty and courage, and the willingness to be uncomfortable for the time that genuine change requires. And none of it is the Sophia stage. None of it is what I am describing when I talk about the small number of empaths who reach the final destination of this particular developmental arc. Because the Sophia stage is not what you arrive at when you have gotten better at the things the earlier stages require. It is what you arrive at when you have completed something that the earlier stages do not complete, something that requires a specific quality of reckoning that most empaths approach and then stop just short of, for reasons that are understandable and human and worth examining without judgment, if the goal is to understand why the stopping happens and what it would take to move through it instead. The thing that most empaths stop short of is this: the complete relinquishment of the wound as identity. And I want to be as precise as possible about what I mean by this, because it is the most important distinction in this entire conversation and the one most likely to be misread if it is not handled carefully. Relinquishing the wound as identity does not mean denying that the wound happened. It does not mean minimizing the damage it caused, pretending the path was not as difficult as it was, performing a forgiveness that is not genuine, or constructing a narrative of the past in which everything that was done to her was secretly for her benefit and therefore not really a wound at all. The wound was real. The damage was real. The cost was real and significant and deserved to be acknowledged and processed and grieved and understood with full seriousness rather than bypassed in the interest of arriving faster at a more comfortable story. All of that acknowledgement and processing and grieving and understanding is not only appropriate, it is essential. It is the work of the earlier stages, and it cannot be skipped, but it can be completed. And the completion of it, the actual genuine, not performed completion of it, requires something that the earlier stages do not require and that the wound, as identity structure specifically, resists. It requires the empath to arrive at a point where the wound is something that happened to her rather than something she is, where the sensitivity that the wound shaped is fully hers and fully owned and fully expressed, without requiring the wound's continued presence to justify the sensitivity's existence, where she can stand in the fullness of everything the path made her without needing the story of the path to be in the foreground of every relationship, every conversation, every presentation of herself to the world. Not because the story is shameful, because she has finally grown large enough that the story is a part of her rather than the whole of her, and the part no longer needs to represent the whole in order for the whole to feel real. This is where most empaths stop. Not because they are not brave enough, not because the growth has not been genuine, not because they have failed to do the work. They stop here because the wound as identity has been providing something that the Sophia stage requires giving up, and giving it up feels, from inside the structure that is being given up, like a loss rather than a completion. The wound as identity provides, first and most fundamentally, an explanation, an organizing narrative for the self that makes sense of everything, why the sensitivity exists, why the relationships have been difficult, why certain patterns keep appearing, why the world has sometimes felt like a place that was not designed for someone who feels this much. This explanation is not wrong. It is accurate, and it has been genuinely useful, and the stage of the journey where it became available, where the empath could finally see the connection between her early experiences and her present patterns, could name what had shaped her and why, could construct a coherent account of her own history that made the confusion of earlier years make sense. That stage was necessary and valuable and produced real psychological relief that should not be underestimated. But the explanation, once it has done its work, needs to be held more loosely than most empaths hold it. Needs to become a chapter of the story rather than the story itself. Needs to be available without being deployed as the primary framework through which every new experience is processed. And the transition from holding the explanation tightly to holding it loosely is the specific transition that most empaths stand at the edge of and do not complete, because completing it requires trusting that the self is real and solid and genuinely hers even without the wound providing its foundation. And that trust, the trust in a self that is not organized around its own history of pain, is the most difficult thing the path to the Sophia stage asks for. And what makes it possible, and why so few empaths find their way to it, and what the Sophia stage actually feels like from the inside for the small number who reach it. That is exactly where we are going next. What makes it possible is not a single breakthrough, not a therapy session that finally unlocks something that was locked before, not a relationship that provides the love that was missing in the formative years, and therefore completes something that was left incomplete, not a spiritual experience that dissolves the wound in a moment of grace that makes everything that preceded it suddenly and permanently resolved. These things can all be genuinely useful. They can all contribute to the conditions in which the transition becomes possible. But none of them is the transition itself, because the transition itself is not an event. It is a practice, a specific daily, deeply unglamorous practice of choosing, in the moments when the wound, as identity structure would automatically activate, to respond from somewhere else instead, to respond from the self that exists independently of the wound rather than from the wound's interpretation of the self. And this practice is unglamorous because it does not produce the kind of visible, nameable, shareable progress that the earlier stages of the journey produced. The earlier stages had milestones, the recognition of the pattern, the leaving of the relationship, the establishment of the boundary that felt impossible and then happened, the development of the language for what had been done and why it had produced the effects it produced. These milestones are real, and they are worth marking. But the practice that leads to the Sophia stage has no milestones in the same sense. It has only the accumulation of ordinary moments in which she chose differently than she would have chosen before. Moments so small and so unremarkable that they produce no story worth telling, no progress worth reporting, no evidence visible enough from the outside to be recognized by anyone watching. Which means that the practice has no external validation attached to it. And the absence of external validation, for someone whose entire developmental arc has been about learning to source validation internally, is the final and most precise test of whether the internal sourcing has become real enough to sustain the work that the Sophia stage requires. Here is what that practice actually looks like in daily life, because without this level of specificity, the concept remains too abstract to be genuinely useful. Someone says something in passing that touches the wound. A comment that would have been, in an earlier stage of the journey, processed through the wound's interpretive framework, and produced a response shaped by the wound's history rather than the present moment's reality. The old response would have been automatic and would have carried the full emotional weight, not just of this comment, but of every similar comment in the wound's long memory. The Sophia stage practice is the moment of noticing that the wound's framework has activated, feeling the activation clearly, with the full sensitivity that has always been present, without either suppressing the feeling or being carried away by it, and then choosing to respond from the present moment rather than from the accumulated history, not from a performed calm that requires the suppression of the genuine feeling, from a genuine groundedness that can hold the feeling and the response in the same moment without either one overtaking the other. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It requires a quality of simultaneous awareness, of the feeling, of the history activating the feeling, of the present reality distinct from the history, and of the self that is capable of distinguishing between all three. That is the most sophisticated psychological operation available to a human being. It is what Jung was pointing toward when he talked about the integration of the shadow. What Goleman was pointing toward when he described the highest expression of emotional intelligence. What every serious framework for human development eventually arrives at when it is taken far enough. And it is what the Sophia stage is built from, one ordinary moment at a time, in the absence of any audience to confirm that the building is happening. Now let's talk about why so few empaths find their way to it, because the answer is more specific than simply that it is difficult. And the specificity matters for anyone who wants to understand what is actually standing between them and the stage they can feel is possible, but has not yet arrived. The first reason is what I would call the community of woundedness. The social ecosystem that forms around shared experiences of pain and that provides something genuinely valuable and genuinely necessary in the earlier stages of a healing journey. But that can, if a person stays inside it long enough, begin to function as a container for the wound rather than a context for moving through it. The community of woundedness is the online space, the friendship group, the therapeutic relationship, or the content ecosystem where the empath's experience is named and validated, and reflected back in ways that produce the recognition and the belonging that were missing in the original wounding context. This community does real work. It provides the language that was missing. It confirms that the experience was real. It reduces the isolation that the wounding produced and replaces it with a sense of being seen and understood that the empath needed desperately and found, in this community, in ways she had not found elsewhere. This is not a criticism of the community. This is an acknowledgement of what it provides and why its provision matters. But the community of woundedness is organized around the wound. Its shared language is the language of the wound. Its primary form of connection is the recognition of shared pain. And a person who stays primarily inside this community for long enough begins, without meaning to and without necessarily being aware of it, to organize her own sense of identity and belonging around the wound in a way that makes the relinquishment of the wound as identity genuinely threatening to her social world. Because if the wound is no longer the organizing principle of who she is no longer fully legible within the community that the wound created. And the fear of that illegibility, the fear of losing the belonging that the community provides, is one of the most consistent and most under-examined barriers to the Sophia stage that exists. The second reason most empaths stop short of the Sophia stage is more internal and more subtle than the first, and it is the one that the empath herself is least likely to identify without significant honest self-examination. It is the secondary comfort that the wound provides in the specific form of moral clarity. Because the wound, as painful as it was and as real as the damage it caused, also provided something that is psychologically extremely useful and extremely difficult to relinquish. A clear account of who was responsible for the difficulty. A story in which her pain is attributable to specific people and specific behaviors and specific failures of care that were genuinely not her fault, genuinely her responsibility to recover from but not to take responsibility for having caused. This moral clarity is not wrong. In most cases it is entirely accurate. The wound was caused by specific things done by specific people, and the attribution of responsibility to those people rather than to herself is not a distortion of reality, but an accurate reading of it. But moral clarity, accurate as it may be, can function as a container for the self in a way that limits how large the self can grow. Because the self that is organized around an accurate account of what was done to it is still a self organized around what was done to it. And the Sophia stage requires a self organized around something else entirely, not around the denial of what was done, not around the forgiveness that is sometimes performed before it is genuine, not around the relinquishment of accurate attribution of responsibility, but around a question that is genuinely different from all of those, a question that the wound, as identity structure, almost never asks because asking it feels disloyal to the pain that the earlier stages validated so carefully and so necessarily. The question is not what was done to me. The question is who am I now, entirely independently of what was done to me. Who am I when the wound is a chapter rather than the narrative? What do I want? What do I value? What moves me? What is mine? Not in response to what was taken or damaged or made difficult, but simply directly, without reference to any of it, as the fullest possible answer to the most fundamental question available to a human being. The empaths who reach the Sophia stage are the ones who find a way to ask and answer that question honestly. And what they find when they answer it is not the absence of the wound's influence. The wound shaped them, and its shaping is permanent, and is, in many of its dimensions, the source of the extraordinary qualities that make the Sophia stage possible for them in a way it would not be possible for someone who had not been through the path that produced it. The sensitivity, the depth of understanding, the capacity for genuine compassion that comes not from theory, but from the specific knowledge of what it feels like to be in pain in the ways she has been in pain, the ability to see people clearly and love them anyway, which is one of the rarest and most extraordinary things one human being can offer another, and which requires having been seen clearly and loved anyway at some point in your own history, even if that point came late and even if it came primarily from yourself. All of this is the wound transformed. All of this is the path made useful. All of this is what the Sophia stage is built from, not the absence of the wound's influence, but the integration of it into a self so much larger than the wound that the wound's shaping is visible as one element of a complex, rich, fully inhabited human being rather than as the defining feature of a person whose full complexity has been organized around a single central experience of pain. And what the Sophia stage actually feels like from the inside, for the empaths who reach it, is something that is surprisingly difficult to describe in language that does justice to it without making it sound more dramatic or more transcendent than it actually is in daily experience. Because the Sophia stage does not feel like an arrival in the sense of a destination reached and now permanently inhabited. It feels more like a quality of company, like the self has finally become good company for itself. Not in the sense of entertainment or distraction, but in the sense of genuine, quiet, sustainable companionship that requires nothing from outside to be sufficient. The empath at the Sophia stage is not someone who has solved the problem of being an empath in a world that does not always know what to do with people who feel this much. She has not made herself smaller to fit the world's tolerance for depth, and she has not isolated herself from the world to protect her sensitivity from its carelessness. She has done something that neither of those options makes possible. She has made her peace with the full size of what she is, with a completeness and a lack of apology that is not performed. That does not require ongoing maintenance. That is simply the natural state of a person who has finally, through everything the path required, arrived at the experience of her own nature as something to inhabit rather than something to manage. She feels things as completely as she always did. She understands people as accurately as she always did. She is present to the world with the same extraordinary, sometimes overwhelming quality of attention that has always been her most defining characteristic. But she carries it differently now. She carries it without the weight of the wound's interpretation of what it means to be someone who feels this much. Without the story that the feeling is a problem, without the history of evidence that the depth is a liability, she carries it as simply what she is. And what she is in the full, undefended, unperformed experience of the Sophia stage is not too much for the world. She is exactly enough. She has always been exactly enough. And the Sophia stage is simply the first time in her life that she knows it without needing anyone to confirm it, without evidence to support it, without the wound's long argument against it requiring a counter-argument to remain standing. It is the knowing that does not need defending, the self that does not need explaining, the life that does not need to be different than it is in order to be genuinely, completely, irrevocably hers. That is the Sophia stage. And it was always where the path was leading. For the empaths who make it there, the whole of the journey, with everything it cost, makes a different kind of sense than it made at any earlier point along the way. Not because the cost was worth it in some transactional accounting, but because the person standing at the destination could not have been built any other way.